right, welcome back, everyone. Had a great lunch here. Hopefully, you had a good about 15-minute break. Those on the interwebs. Yeah, we're going to talk about funding now, and I'm going to hand it over to Scott. He's going to talk through a few slides, and I'll talk through a few slides, and we'll have a conversation as a community.
Awesome. Thank you, Brendan. Okay, so I'm going to try to set the stage with a couple of history slides and it's current expenses, just some snapshots. Mostly, it'll hopefully just facilitate some conversation. So this is an old plot which I updated this week, and it's a hint that back in the day, in previous administrations federally, there was funding for Orcasound, and it came through a 5-year grant to the Whale Museum. Back when Val was president of the board of the Whale Museum, and he and I were PIs on that grant. So that's what the beginning of this plot is order of $50,000 being invested in growing 1 or 2 hydrophones into 5 hydrophones back in the early 2000s, late 2000s. So that 5-year grant ended in 2011, and so we had to make an initial decision back then about do we keep going or let it stop. And so we decided to basically keep it going, but in a extremely frugal state. So trying to keep stuff running for a while. And honestly, it was sort of looking for solutions that led us to the idea of crowdfunding and a Kickstarter. We met Ty, who introduced us to people like Paul and then Skander. And so we started experimenting around 2017. You see that green spike was the Kickstarter. I almost invited the Kickstarter community to participate in this, but I figured next year that would be a really interesting reconnection, is to go back and say, hey, we did everything that we said we were going to do in the Kickstarter. How about we kickstart something else? And would you like to be part of creating that? Yeah.
I don't have to answer questions right now, but I just want to say, I talked to Brendan, and I think it'd be also great to do one of these sorts of things, but for the listener community. I think that would be the opportunity to Kickstarter.
Yes, awesome idea. I like that. Yeah, so crowdfunding leveraged people initially, and it allowed us to start this process of hiring somebody other than Val to write the software, right? And thankfully, Paul and Skander led us to this whole concept of open source software development, which comes with the benefit of sometimes not having to pay people. And so there's this other era of, which is a little hard to quantify, but I sort of called it hackathons, right? There was pre-COVID, there was a lot of value we got out of hackathons organized by Democracy Lab. Also, Valentina had a hack day here, which was maybe one of my first hack-like experiences, where talented grad students and Shima Abadi, a professor here, we just throw data at them, and I think Shima had found killer whale calls within an hour or two of showing her some raw data from the Oregon coast. So for me, there was a big lesson there that there's real value in sharing your data with people and giving them some meaningful work to do on a Saturday. So I've tried to quantify that and maybe note that it sort of has dropped off in the last couple of years. We still have done the Microsoft hackathon, but Democracy Lab, I think, has struggled to find a way to keep that momentum going post-COVID. And so the other thing that I've been adding here is sort of this reflection of BeamReach, which is Val and I, using philanthropic funds that were aimed at general tech innovation for conservation to invest more and more in the software that, in the sort of the whole process of developing a community, looking for resiliency. So we don't want to keep doing that. We would like to find a new model where we take what we built and use it as a foundation and sort of incrementally improve it in a way that's sustainable. I don't know what that model is. I thought it was going to be NOAA funding, but that's not going to be for another 4 years for sure. So we may have an opportunity over the next 4 years to sort of keep experimenting with blends of these sources. So that's sort of the context for this slide. And yeah, go ahead, Dave.
So how much of this is software versus actual hydrophone hardware?
Yeah, so good question.
Repeat that question. Repeat it.
Oh, yeah. So how much of this plot is hardware funding,
Hydrophone hardware fund, yeah.
hardware funding versus open source software funding.
And cloud resources, et cetera.
Yeah, so I think this graph conflates those things. The NOAA money was, the research funds, the blue, were hardware, and the regional office was education and outreach, which back then meant making it easy for people to listen using MP3 streams, Winamp, and whatever you had on your mobile cell phone, flip phones, often. So it was kind of a mix back in the governmental funding day. And I suspected that's what we would have asked for if we had gone back to the regional office, is an investment in both. Most of what's reflected in the end here is all software. And the next plot is really trying to articulate that I've been trying to move towards this model of each hydrophone location, often a nonprofit itself, raising funds for its hardware, but not necessarily for the open source software all of the locations share. So what we've been trying to do, Val and I, investing in coding and cloud infrastructure, is to like build a bunch of infrastructure that works for all of those locations, at the same time teaching them like what does it take in terms of volunteerism or technical staff or ordering parts to support the physical network. The nice thing about having roughly 20 NGOs operating together under a memorandum of agreement, like that's pretty much all we have, is like a 2-page document saying we shall share software and data, is that many of those 20 NGOs are nonprofits, and so they can take charitable donations. So like Dave's organizations can take in funds from Microsoft matching on a hackathon, and so can Orca Network. And some of that trickles down to supporting the hardware at their respective locations, and some of it gets reinvested into software. But mostly the software funding is coming through this other non-charitable channel on the right there. So that has been in the form of many things, like some of these groups that will make your hydrophones for you will give Orcasound a discount. And so there's some value there where it's technically a hydrophone manufacturer who's adding some funding or value to the I guess that's more of a hardware thing, but yeah, so this is changing, and sort of tried to update this. This is kind of where I was going a year ago, is looking for a nonprofit in the middle that could take charitable funds and put it into the software. Earth Island Institute in San Francisco was kind of interested in that, but it didn't work out. But that's something we could talk about is, and I think you've talked about, like, should Orcasound be its own nonprofit that could take charitable donations itself? Yeah.
Well, you refer to the Springer rescue itself, really, working on something that will be real story. Yeah, real life story. You know, all the money you're doing, going into the bank account. You spend it in that account, but you have to be shared so that, you know, work with conservancy in the company, so, you know, we want to buy ice to the people who are doing research and all, so, you know, you kind of vote one line for the money.
Yeah.
Say it was a collective of one of the organizations in the the song.
Yeah.
You can do that.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. So for those who couldn't hear, Dave's suggesting that, like, the fund a program within an existing nonprofit, like the one that was used to support the Springer rescue, could be a model. I totally agree. Orca Network in some ways has acted like that for I'd say some part of that time series I showed, Post Whale Museum, and I'm a big fan of trying to leverage existing organizations rather than make new ones. But I think there's a couple of choices of how we could do that. Oops, this didn't get updated. Yeah, so I guess the last piece of what I was going to say was in terms of cloud expenses. I think they're slowly growing, but we also have incrementally reduced costs. So I had a slide that just showed like in 2023, our cloud costs pre-sponsorship were like $1,500 a month. And some of that's gone up and some of it's gone down. Like as we add nodes, we've moved up, and like Heroku has a small monthly fee now, but we've gotten rid of SendMail expenses by switching to Amazon. The big change in terms of, I think over time, my sense is that we're going to find more sponsorship opportunities, cloud credits, and those costs will go down over time. And the Amazon sponsorship is a great example of that. So I think we need to look at the Azure burn rate, but I think in terms of Amazon expenses, we've just taken a big step down in terms of not having to pay for storage or egress. So we can go into further detail, but that's kind of the overview I wanted to set up. The last thing that maybe you're going to talk about a little bit is just, we did do this experiment of setting up a collective, which many open source software organizations have used existing entities. Like there's this California company, nonprofit called Open Source Collective. We're kind of a program of them, and mostly what that gives us is access to a platform where we can raise funds, but not charitable funds. So you can take in donations of, but not charitable donations. So maybe that's a segue to what you're going to talk about, but I do think it's worth taking some time to look at what other open source communities have done to both in terms of governance and funding, as we sort of look to the future and think about how to possibly restructure. Yeah.
This one is a little bit hard to read, so let me see if I interpret this right.
Yeah.
Orcasound as a organization, using the term very loosely, it sounds like you can either define it as the entire slide, you can define it as the green box on the right. It looks like the green box on the left, if I understand right, you're saying that's other organizations like OBI and so on that are Orcasound proper, right? For just people contribute to the overall effort, right? And so if I looked at the pie chart for Orcasound, it's only the software, which is the bottom two, the two rightmost rows, with a hydrophone network. If I were to say, what is your ideal pie chart of funds for which purpose for Orcasound, it sounds like you'd say 0% hardware because all that is funded by node-specific stuff. That's the idea. Is that correct? Is that what this is saying?
I might rephrase your interpretation a little bit, but I understand exactly what.
I'm trying to interpret this.
Yeah, that's how I can totally see how you'd see it that way. I would put a historical lens on it and say Orcasound, in my mind, used to just be the upper left box.
Yeah.
It was a handful of hydrophone hosts trying to get share data, and all they had to organize that was an MOA, which needs to be realized, by the way. Like, now's a good time to rethink this because the current MOA goes through 2025. But since the advent of this open source software community, which you're part of, it's not just a physical hydrophone network, it's also an open source project. And so that's you're right, that mostly what we're talking about as software is that green box on the right. But the collective part is meant to represent the fact that we are a collective in this California entity called the Open Source Collective. And so they take 10% of whatever comes in. So if Brennan and I give them $10 a month, they take $1 of that. So there's some costs associated with using that mechanism that might be different. Like Earth Island Institute was only going to take 7% of charitable contributions. So those are some sort of things I've been thinking about, comparing possible funnels of money into the open source software effort. But yeah, so that's my slightly different interpretation. Is that?
Yeah, I was mostly asking about the future and future question mark. Okay, you talk about the past, talk about the present. Say, what's the aspiration? What should the pie chart look like in terms of X% on protein contracts, X% on volunteer support and option, how much on cloud services versus how much on software development, how much on meetings like this or whatever. What would the ideal breakdown for different categories of costs be for the Orcasound as a entity that's separate from the entity that, like, I own this particular hydrophone itself, right? As a
Yeah, it's a good question. I
Oh,
don't,
yeah.
that might,
It just says future, I'm asking, what
Yeah.
does it look like in the future? What's the ideal, right? What's our aspiration? And, you know, we don't know how we're gonna get there.
If I had a suggestion, and I can talk a little bit more about it later, would probably be, dependent on what our goals are as an organization, and then we can decide what resources we want. So it's a probably more global discussion.
yeah. That pie chart might be a good product, like a draft pie chart could be a good product for
Is
today.
our goal that the cloud expansion be zero because self-donated?
Yeah, there you go.
That's the sort of stuff we want to envision, right?
I think the goal is that the pie chart is a point, so we don't have any expense.
I think kind of speaking to Scanner's point, I think what I was looking for out of this is basically like, what is our current funding state?
Yeah.
And then I think we should talk about governance state. And then after we know those two things, I think it's gonna be a lot easier to decide like,
Yeah.
what do you want to do about both? Because they are very tied together, right?
Yeah.
Like, because it's all about how we structure both how we make decisions, but also like how we fund things.
I don't know if this is fair to do to the folks online, but I can make a pie chart. So current funding, let's say for 2024, like the main sources of funds were $20,000 from Quiet Sound to Orca Conservancy. Not sure what fraction, what's our total would be here. And something like $100,000, I think, so let's call it 20% was Quiet Sound. And another 20% for hardware was WVFW. And that grant went through Open Network. So that's
This is your
it.
income, right? This is income, not expenses, right?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Maybe you can grab if you just point your laptop, if you're logged into Meet call, not that one, yours, Scott.
Your individual one, right?
You're in the caller, right?
Yeah, maybe just, can we try my?
Turn it towards the,
Label the circle income at the top, right? If that's what it is.
Although at this point, only Val, who is the only one on the call who's not here.
Yeah, he probably knows all this.
The stream.
Yes, it's YouTube streams.
I don't think I think the stream is only
Seven watching.
from his, I think the, yeah.
But yeah,
from
that's
Brandon's.
but I pinned it.
Yeah, so
Take
that's,
a snapshot of
His video.
Yeah, but like in the YouTube stream.
20% is like.
Oh, he's gonna show, oh, it's from the, oh, cool, okay.
all right, so maybe I should just, Spencer, we should list these, and then I may have to make the pie chart later if we
Yeah,
get more
yeah.
quantitative, but.
Yep.
I think we have about $1,400 per month in cloud expenses. And that's shifted between Azure and AWS and a few other things.
That's 3 buckets.
Let's see, what are other ongoing expenses? Yeah, I mean, there's small stuff like monthly registration of all these domain names and things like that. And then what do you think each node is spending per year? We basically budgeted 4 to 5K per year per node is sort of how we broke up this revenue, with a little bit of slush for like trying to get further out. But that's roughly what node maintenance costs of hardware and the labor to fix it. So this is kind of most of what's coming into this green box. Yeah, so that's the other chunk, like Cambridge is, can you go back one slide? Can you get a chance? Cambridge has been investing more since we lost most of the dev input through hackathons. So we're sort of at 50K-ish a year, most recently, like last year. And sort of, I would call it like foundational development, like trying to develop public repository code bases that then can be built upon incrementally through things like assuming that we get back to hackathon or a larger contributor, a more sustainable model of contributing through open source code. So I guess that's,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Like, when it's about people kind of effort, in the university, you have these multipliers that you have to like overpass.
yeah.
Just wondering how it works with Orcasound.
Well, so each of the nonprofits usually takes 10% typically for overhead for
Okay.
administering the grant.
Okay.
So it's a lot cheaper than academia, usually through a non-profit. Overhead rate for universities is usually like more than 50%. Yeah, so something like 50K, let's call it 30 to 50K. That's what Val and I have been putting in 2 contracts, but the hope is that we don't have to do that once we have a whole set of products and the code base, that then we can find devs through, like we used to, through hackathons, or run Kickstarter in order to hire that needs to implement certain features. The reason we thought this was worthwhile is like, if we feel, Val and I feel value in, we have 40 repositories now, with some of which are, production sites that are potentially very valuable, certainly valuable to us, but maybe valuable to other communities that study somniferous species. So. Yeah, so the income is, there's investment that varies by year. It's usually been Beamreach recently, NOAA historically, and sometimes more innovative things like Kickstarters. So I guess that's why I was leaving the majority of the pie chart to other types of funding aimed at the software infrastructure.
So Orcasound is an organization?
Yeah, so it's a program of Maritime Blue, which is a 501c3, and sort of mandated by one of the state recommendations from the Southern Resident Killer Whale Task Force that government recently set up. So they have some mandate to ask for state funds, and they're having some success. They get a little bit of investment from the Port of Seattle. So they invested in the hydrophone network generally, trying to keep us going in terms of detecting animals at night and on foggy days, but maybe improve our hydrophones enough that we could maybe tell them which direction the whales are going someday. Getting direction out of the existing information would be valuable to them.
So I just want to say, I have some thoughts on funding. I know we don't have that much time in the discussion, so I don't know exactly what we want to prioritize. But my core thinking around funding is, in some way, we need to demonstrate to someone that who would provide funding that what we're doing is valuable, whether it's like, some government agency, or it's an end user who just wants to listen to orcas, or someone who wants to donate to a charitable cause.
Or the end product, the end data product.
Or the data itself, especially, the marine stuff, the vessel traffic stuff is actually a great example of this, where potentially, there is also an interest there, who are actually providing value to someone. So I would say that's one of the core things to think about, is what, and maybe explore and talk to all the people who like Orcasound of what's valuable to them in it, and try to do a little bit of exploration and discovery around what people find valuable, and maybe things we're not doing that could be valuable. And then I'll also say, in terms of sources, it really all breaks down into there's basically, donations, there's grants, and there's actual revenue that we provide a service, and people pay us, users might pay, or someone pays for the, data is harder because data is open. But that's kind of how I think about it. So just to kind of see maybe directions to think about. Those are all directions we can try to go in. But that's
Donations, revenue, monetization.
Yeah, I think it's donations, grants, which are really just, as I was kind of joking, scanning, grants are really just very sophisticated donations where you have to, hit certain metrics and work with maybe bureaucratic agencies. And then really the other source is just revenue, actually direct revenue from users or consumers of data, or other derived notifications, everything else we have.
In theory, there's another one, which is if you do an endowment program, then you could have investment income if you have some base.
Yeah, that's true. That's right.
Maybe one more is quote unquote equity raising, but by that you could do it through cooperatives where people buy into the cooperative of Orcasound, which I can talk about a little bit more. But yeah, that's one way to raise money. I think maybe on a one-time basis, but I don't know that would be a steady state.
So it's like investing in it?
Quote unquote, like basically if we create a cooperative, I can talk more about different structures, but just like in a grocery co-op, for example, or like Costco or whatever, you pay your membership fee and then you get access to certain things, including voting.
A premium membership.
Free, yeah, for sure.
Kind of
Something
like a
like,
revenue model.
sure, in some ways, yeah, although.
So I would still put an endowment on there, even if we don't choose to do one, right? Just because it is another possible model. Many 501c3s and organizations do. In your will stuff to us, we'll invest that, and then we'll just use the annual increase for expenses. So
I think a key piece to that though is providing, tax advantage for donors.
correct, which gets to the
Yeah.
governance and structure model.
Right now it's not really set up.
But we're going to talk about that next, right?
Yeah, we will. That is the next conversation. And also like all of these are actually independent of, charitable versus non-charitable. You can do charitable donations, non-charitable. You can do charitable revenue, you can do non-charitable revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Scanner will talk about that. I don't want to.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah.
I like to just add a contract. Is this kind of separate from the grants or like, I don't know if that's something that's in the history, like you have a contract with one of these city agencies or they come as grants? Kind of, I'm trying to distinguish grants from contracts where it's like, oh, you really are to this and kind of like a.
Yeah, so these are both contracts for sure. These were not like, there's no competition for these.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are contracts as opposed to like, we have a museum that, that's actually a little bit of, wasn't super transparent to me, like whether there was an open call for this 5-year grant the Whale Museum got from NOAA, but usually NOAA has some sort of competition.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like grants are kind of like a gray area. They could like kind of do donations, but they could also kind of like look like contracts, right? There's kind of like this.
How they're structured.
Yeah, it really depends on the structure. But I think at the end of the day, like, I guess you could consider that you're providing value to someone and they're paying you for it. So it's more of a contract.
Explicitly, everybody's expecting something out of it.
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to like, is there something valuable that we're doing for whoever it is? And I think that's what it really comes down to. And then we can put definitions around what that is or isn't.
And
Well, contracts usually have specific goals. Grants sort of set the direction.
Yeah.
We got a lot of flexibility in how you achieve the goals.
but they still expect a report or something that shows that what they're, even just a private citizen giving you money is hoping to find out later that helped the whales.
They're not going to sue you for breach of grant.
No, for sure.
I have one more point I want to make just about funding in general.
There's more people that you're accountable to, like everybody you take money from, you're accountable to. Sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't do. But the other thing I was just kind of thinking about funding, and thinking about these like different sources of funding. One thing I think I find like a cool idea is to try to think about the different aspects of things we want to fund. We talked about, we have cloud costs, we have hydrophones, we have software costs. It's interesting to try to line up. I think it's a good idea to try to line up the funding to be have some sort of alignment with the thing it's doing, right? So for example, I think it's a cool idea to try to line up like hydrophone funding with the local community who actually listens to that hydrophone, versus, they might not be as interested in what the end data is or something. But I think that's another way we can look at funding is like, that's probably closer to what we're actually providing the value for the person who's doing funding, right? You sponsor your local hydrophone, you immediately feel, an attachment to like, well, my contributions are going to letting you listen to it.
Want to give your perspective on it?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I won't go over Open Collective, we've already talked about it, we all love Open Collective. But, there's also GitHub sponsor, and I'm coming at this from a, like, raising funds with your friends and family approach, right? And then, I'm using Patreon to try to raise funds for the UX work that I do. And to give you a little bit of a context about how challenging raising funds is, I reached out to a little over 800 people, my connections on LinkedIn, and I have 7 funders right now at $5 a month. So that's not paying any bills. right? So I could definitely put more time and effort into fundraising, but that's not like what I want to do with most of my time and effort, right? So, individuals raising their own funds, like I'm trying to do with Patreon, is definitely a challenge. One challenge I have is I can't offer, tax advantage, like I mentioned earlier, for donations. So, how can we do that? There's obviously like, organizations that, take in the funds for us and distribute the funds, like to me, like if I went to, use Orca Conservancy, for example, and say, hey, will you be my bank account basically? I can use their 501c3 status and then offer that to, potential donors. So, that's just an example. I'm not asking for that, but that's one model, and that's something that I would like to explore a bit more on the individual, fundraising side of things. Yeah, and then I have to prove my value as a UX researcher and as a UX leader, not only to Orcasound, but to people who potentially will fund my work. So, that's a lot of convincing to do. So yeah, I just want to open up that conversation too. And, we talked about Kickstarter, those kind of like fundraising platforms that are becoming or have been popular for a while. And there's more than just Kickstarter and Patreon out there, but those are some of the more well-known ones. So yeah, one thing Scott has told me is if you reach a certain level of contributorship to Orcasound, you can raise funds for yourself through Orcasound. So like I'm in the Hall of Fame, and so I can raise funds, right? And so we got to talk about governments in that way, right? Like who can raise funds for themselves? Is what Scott doing, is that a model that we should follow, or should we do something else? Yeah, totally open for discussion there.
You mind pulling up the collective real quick?
Yeah.
Website.
Also, you might want to switch the video back to speaker.
Yeah, so Open Collective, there's a term for what they do. It's called fiscal sponsorship, which is they're the 501c3, and then people can, store their money there. I wonder, I don't know what it takes for it to be a fiscal sponsor yourself. I don't know if there's like regulatory hurdles. But I mean, they do.
Yes, thank you for bringing a term to.
Yeah, there's a name for everything.
Yeah,
sure.
So here, you probably are familiar with this, but here's our collective profile page here, and you can fund at different levels. Call yourself different types of funders, whichever name you find most appealing. So like a UX Research Fund has been created so people can fund UX research, they can fund t-shirts, or they can fund lower cost hydrophones. So these are like projects that people can specifically like earmark basically with their funds. And then there's the events here. So I don't know, I've kind of like advertised this with my friends and family a little bit, but no one has contributed that I know of. So yeah, Scott.
Look at budget. I haven't used this much either, but yeah, it's also, you can see a little bit of activity in the icons right below these buttons. So like if you look at that latest activity, click on one of those, what do we see? What I don't see is like, I'm trying to get a number here for like how much have we accumulated in 2024 through the various entities and people giving to us.
Oh,
This person is very rich.
very.
GitHub sponsors the
I
whole
think
thing.
it's all
Really
getting
a lot.
I think it's a,
Which is actually not that much money given.
Yeah, give it to GitHub. Yeah. All the projects on GitHub together through Open Collective.
All right, so that just links to their bios. What about on the budget?
Yeah, it's in our budget.
There's maybe, you can see transactions coming in here. Okay, balance there. That's what I wanted.
Several dollars.
What's that?
Yeah, that's several dollars.
I think that's
If you,
what's left of 5K from experiment.com, which I think actually came in late 2023. 2K from GSOC mentors who said they wanted to get contribute their mentor fees to a t-shirt fund, as long as they got t-shirts out of the deal.
T-shirt.
Yeah.
Yeah, are the t-shirts. They want more teachers?
Yeah, and where's the low-cost hydrophone too, right? Like, it's easy for us to get money in a budget here, but not be super transparent about, oh, did we finish spending all that? Like, is there any left over? Did the delivers? So this is partly a segue to governance. Like, there are a few people who can accept invoices through the collective, but they were just ones who volunteered. There's no election or, yeah, it's sort of been random empowerment rather than organized empowerment. But that number is also important, like something like a few $100s, maybe $500 has come in through monthly giving to the collective itself.
And why is the open collective more than the 5K?
Oh, in terms of the pie chart?
Yeah.
Excellent question. Focus on pie chart.
Use your
It's a
imagination.
circular notepad. That's what it is.
Does the organization have a mission statement?
Well, yeah, I guess if you look in the MOA, there's some history and mission statement, maybe not formally, but I think it's articulated that.
You're sort of talking about needing to formalize the organization in some way. And so to say, what is this thing really for? Is it just,
Yeah,
it feels like we're doing a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And like figuring out who our audience is, but figuring out who we take money from and how has a lot to do with what we actually want to do, right? And focusing enough to be able to do that well.
Should we talk about,
We'll come back to that, some of that in governance, but
yeah, I was gonna, should we talk about governance? That sounds like,
Yeah.
we're a bit, like, I'm like,
it might be there, yeah.
I think it sounds like we want to talk about governance and,
Yeah, we can, that's the next thing, so we can just flow. into
that's what I'm saying. Maybe, I think it'd be
Flow.
actually great to go over the MOA since it's expiring this year. I don't know if it was in the slides necessarily, but I think it'd be actually great to all review together because I learned a lot by reading it, so.
Yeah, okay. And so an important caveat to your point, Peter, is like that MOA is for the physical hydrophone network. And then most of it was written 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily pertain to the Orcasound software community. which-
Public facing.
Yeah, and we keep evolving in ways that create value, right? The software itself is valuable. The data products are valuable. Like when we detect a killer whale, Quiet Sound benefits because if we get it into a Karsia, vetted with some caveats about which species they want, the ships get informed.
Ultimately, it's all about conservation.
Yeah.
That's tying it together.
Yeah, and WDFW wanted, that was oil spill response. They wanted more information about where the animals are there. Hopefully never happens scenario of an oil spill. So we're delivering value through the acoustic detections that resulted in this. For me, this was new, the idea that there's state funding coming to us. It's been a long time since we ever had a WDFW grant related to the hydrophone infrastructure. So that was a big year for government funding. I try to reflect that in the uptick, but I'm not sure I can put that on the graph. We'll move back to slides. So, yeah, sweet. Awesome. So that was your slide, right? Okay.
Two versions of the same slide.
Governance, yes.
Perfect, here we go.
Sweet. So this is kind of what we were talking about. I'll segue to standard chatting, teaching us a little bit about politics soon, but maybe first on the left side, I can show you two things. One is the entities that have signed the MOA. Maybe I'll show you the MOA first. So this, you can get to this through the join page. Maybe I'll start there because it has a little more context. I'm now curious to see. So this is mostly recruiting the numbers that are listed here and roughly order of signing this MOA. So that's how it gets to it. If you're curious. So here it says we have a long history, which the primary goal is to help conserve So killer whales are also monitoring, studying underwater stamps across the range and educating public around marine biologistics, noise pollution, and marine sustainability. So that's sort of a mission statement here.
Yeah, that's right.
An asset is the archive, but for a while we were building out this equipment pool. Part of the MOA says that if you decide to shut down your node, that you first offer your equipment to the rest of the network. But mostly the benefits are you get to have access to everybody else's live stream and data. And any shared, if we go in and see it, it's an awesome learning tool. And we did it with kind of in the Seattle Aquarium. We made sure that that's open and accessible to the other members of the network. So for towns that could implement the same education and outreach display using our sounds. So that was the general things, like from the beginning, try to get people to buy into being open, real time, and share. So that's mostly what it's about. So that's kind of Orcasound. Like there's no legal entity, and there's no, until we had this collective, there was no bank account.
And all of this infrastructure that we have built around the apps and things, you would have to be able to justify as serving the members of the cooperative and through them their communities. Whereas it really feels like this is becoming its own thing, which is serving the public more generally and directly.
Yeah, that's true. Like what we're building,
Maybe attention there.
I can say that like what we're building for Southern residents will probably turn out to be useful for other marine species in the ecosystem or other significant species in other parts of the planet, but their own communities trying to save those species. So I do think you're right. We're growing value outside of this immediate mission statement, which we haven't really thought about, I don't think.
And how does that kind of, to also like just generally all these efforts increasing the education and the research in this domain, and that by itself can be back in just all the collaboration that has, and then contract or whatever. So just the general education research aspect of that.
Yeah, but you could justify those in terms of conservation. I don't think there's a conflict there.
No. Although sometimes, you know, like it's a question of whether conservation is the only goal, because it could be also other research questions.
So I have a question, like what does it look like to join, like currently MOA, like who can join and yeah, what does that look
Yeah.
like? And what are the limits on that?
I usually I have a list down here of prospective members that I usually invite. Sometimes they ask, like this example, Michael Kundu he said he'd like to join. I didn't know who he was. I still have never met him. And I'm not sure that he's gotten any value out of it, but he was mostly offering a vessel if we ever put a hydrophone up near Point Roberts at the border. So
The top says for member organizations and individuals, right? So that means you don't have to be an organization, you can just be an individual and join.
yeah, and sometimes like it's a one-man show, like not sure what Project Seawolf is, but it might just be Michael. Let's see, right?
He has a lot of volunteers that work with him, but he's probably the only staff member. Imagine he's got a board of directors working with him also.
So Joe Olson and Lon Roplehurst are good examples of that, Dave, where it's a one-person for-profit that's making hydrophones. But they want to support the spirit of the organization, and maybe provide, they might want to take advantage of this, like the ability to write a small business development grant under the auspices of Orcasound.
So yeah, I guess that's it's also not limited to specific type of organization. Like, you know, it can't be doesn't have to be nonprofit or charitable. Like anyone can really join in.
Yep, and there is no governance, like it's just me inviting people to sign a Google sheet, a Google Doc. So
So
yeah,
when they,
How active are any of these members? Like, you said there's no governance, are they at least, do they remember that they're part of this? I mean,
that's a good question. I think sometimes they forget. For example, for the whale Center for Whale Research. Ken died last year, the year before. So I haven't gotten Michael to re-sign this. So yeah, I think there's a wide range of involved, from literally dead to very active. Like most of these people are administering grants for us or trying to keep their hydro funds running.
So what happens right now if they're a signatory and then don't follow the responsibilities?
I might not even know about it, but if I did, I would harass them. Yeah, I think that's sort of there's no annual meeting of these people. Maybe that I've thought about inviting them to the summit, for example. Like maybe if there was a critical mass of folks trying to make decisions about the physical hydrogen network. I've often thought we used to have a listserv for these folks so that you could at least post the listserv if you had created new content that the other groups would be interested in. But that's also pretty inactive. So usually it's me reminding them that they're signatories and they have a benefit that they should realize as opposed to a responsibility.
Yeah, and right now, the way that I read it here, everybody on that list should either be maintaining a hydrophone or contributing to the GitHub repositories. And if they're not doing either of them, then they're not following the responsibilities of being a member. That's how I read it right now. And I would love that to be the case, that all these people are either maintaining a hydrophone, which I can see a lot of them are, right? Or they're contributing to GitHub repositories.
So
If not, then why are they here, or are we missing our responsibility
so
in the first bullet?
so yes, but there's a nuance in that maintaining a node could mean an educational node, like the Pat Price listening
Right,
station.
Yep.
Where there's almost no maintenance unless something breaks, but it's a valuable resource and sort of an endpoint of the network rather than a source point.
But we don't have people who maintain repositories in that list right now, right?
Yeah, so that's maybe a good point, that this was built mainly for the physical
Yeah.
infrastructure. And a lot of the onboarding materials like in GitHub and in what we use for onboarding volunteers into the Orcasound open source community are really different. And the roles and responsibilities probably are not as clearly articulated. Maybe they should be. We have codes of conduct, I guess, but in contributing guidelines within repos, but I'm not sure we're agreed upon like the general benefits and responsibilities of being a member of the community.
I think the first bullet under member responsibilities is pretty well worded right now. I mean, it covers maintaining hydrophones or education outreach infrastructure, which you just make some Pat prices in that category, or contributing to repositories, right? So we have some node, whether it's a hydrophone node or an
Yeah.
educational node, or so you got those three possibilities right now. And I think everybody that you mentioned tends to fit into one of those three unless they're defunct. That's kind of what I was asking about. Let's say they were at one point, but no longer are interested or whatever. Do we clean them off? Do we have them do some other role?
There's also kind of an intermittent status, like I think Ocean Initiative has had hydrophones operating in the past. I don't know if they have any currently operating, but I'm pretty sure they will again in the future.
Yep.
So I don't think there's any reason to drop them while they're between hydrophones or,
Right.
Sound Action has been out of action for a little over a year and, they're planning to get back in action soon. So, I don't think there would have been any need to kick them out last year while we're waiting for them to get their hydrophone replaced.
I'm just wondering if there's something else we should add to the or provide significant support to the marketing of Orcasound's, initiatives or something like that, goals, right?
Yeah.
Where now you're not associated with you're not associated with a node per se. You're not associated with a GitHub repository, but you have some other inherent role that helps to promote our mission, right?
Yeah, so this is starting to be a pretty good segue, I think, to maybe what you could tell us about Scander, but I'll
Just to add, like, for this list, maybe like a 2-year kind of maybe it shouldn't be this indefinitely.
5 years?
I don't know. We decide, somebody decides, but that
Makes sense.
can allow for cleaning after 20 years.
And reorientation, because projects evolve, right?
I'll leave you with the thought that it feels nascent, but I think we're starting to share power and in a sense govern ourselves in terms of open source software through GitHub. We have a variety of themes there. We allow people to create their own repositories, but there's increasingly rules and standards in support to people like Dave for like how you contribute to the repositories and how the software gets reviewed and revised. So, and then also the collective, as I alluded to, like once we have more money flowing through the collective, it may become important to have find who gets those roles. You can approve, you understand a budget, you can approve voices related to it. But I'm still comfortable, and I think it's been successful. Like, say, one of your rights is to your funds under the auspices of this system. The collective, I think, is an interesting experiment. I'm not sure how useful it'll be in the long run, but it feels like maybe. Yeah, I think that's what we kind of touched upon most of the current sources of funds through this whiteboarding activity.
Is there some way to touch on kind of action items? Maybe we get to that in the next segment, but I guess this conversation is making me think, okay, we need to write some grant proposals. We need to develop a Kickstarter video. We need to find grants that fund this sort of thing. There's a research aspect to that. There's a visioning aspect where if we want to make the login portal in some way incorporate either a donation or a subscription aspect to it. Those are the ones I can think of right now.
I would suggest, at least in this little segue scanner, that I think the first thing before all of that stuff, I think, is actually deciding on what the governance should look like, because it all, because that establishes how everything goes. I think the main action item would be deciding on governance, really, and deciding what a process for how we should figure that out, and try to include, everyone who's currently involved in the Orcasound community.
Thanks. Money flow diagram, you might want to have extra column. After money goes into Orca Network, it goes out of Orca Network to other organizations.
Yeah.
The same thing with Orca Conservancy. So
yeah,
that would kind of capture that. Like one organization is the central account for different organizations.
Yeah, that would be an interesting exercise we could do down here, which sort of relates to the other future partners. Money could flow between existing partners and also future partners.
So I am thrilled to get to talk about co-ops. It is before I start, actually, one fun fact: the word governance shares the same Greek root for cybernetics, and the meaning of cybernetics in Greek is Kubernetes. Is navigation. So governance is all about navigation as an organization. I want to talk about co-ops a little bit, what they are, co-op principles. There's all sorts of types of cooperatives. It's kind of mind-boggling what can be a cooperative, benefits, and then maybe options for what Orcasound could look like as a cooperative. So, what is a cooperative? At the base of it, it's really just democratic control of an organization for the benefit of its membership. So members can be individuals, and they can be organizations that they themselves are cooperatives. So you can have cooperatives of cooperatives, or like a mix and match. Really just like the definition of a member. At the top level, it's just like voting for a board of directors, and then the board of directors is basically like the legislature that then lets the operation, like it gives direction to the operation. And then co-ops can be many different kinds of legal structures. They can be LLCs, they can be the corporations themselves, the cooperatives themselves can be nonprofits, C Corps. There's a Washington LCA, which is a limited cooperative association, like that was created in 2019, so fairly recently. There's different co-op organizations. Colorado is a pretty good one. They have a lot of co-op related stuff there too. By the way, stop me if you have any questions. So yeah, co-op principles. So these were created by one of the first cooperatives in the UK in like 1844. And so the top like 7 that are like super famous in the co-op community are voluntary and open membership, which means anyone can come and go, or like it's a voluntary association. So you can't stop someone from leaving, and they're open to having people join as long as they, do the things that members are required to do. Democratic member control means 1 member, 1 vote for the board of directors. Member economic participation. This usually means like some form of there are notes that I can access. Just to remember, yeah, in the sorry about that. So yeah, I copy pasted them there. They are very famous things that you can look up yourself, but yeah. Member economic participation. Okay, so members contribute equitably to the capital of their co-op. So that was what I meant by like, raising equity. You can have people basically put money in the context of like a worker cooperative. That's usually taken out of someone's paycheck to create a general capital account. But like when it comes to like grocery co-ops, like I don't know, you pay $100 fee or whatever, and then you're a member. You get to vote. I don't know how it works for credit unions. Credit unions are technically co-ops. You can be a co-op that way. I guess just having maybe a minimum balance counts. Autonomy and independence. The idea is that the cooperative does not sort of bind its membership to any agreement. So like, one moment. Okay, so whatever the co-op does, like in terms of agreements with other organizations, it maintains its, it ensures democratic control by the members. So you can't like sell yourself off. And then, I guess the membership could vote to sell themselves off, but like the cooperative can't do that on its own without like the members sort of agreeing. Education, training, and information. They're committed to educating sort of people about co-ops. Cooperation among cooperatives is a big one. It's called Principle 6. You'll hear it a lot. Encourages cooperation among cooperatives. And then finally, concern for community. That's the easiest one for Orcasound. You have concern for the community you're doing. That is the big one. All right, I went over the types of co-ops. So benefits of co-ops, like most straightforwardly, you can align the interests of the organization with the interests of the membership. And class purpose. Yeah, I don't know, like, I think that's self-explanatory. You don't have different interests basically. So you can share like prosperity or savings or whatever it is, like whatever, like it is, so like rural co-ops, for example, like it's literally the membership that owns. So it's like, you're not gonna get like price hikes basically, just because like the profits or whatever it is, it's supposed to go back to the membership. So there's actually an active incentive to keep costs low.
Like from the beginning.
There's a sad thing there where like you end up, actually I guess I'll talk about it, the potential downsides. Organizational stability, so co-ops have been shown to be a lot more stable in time because again, your interests are aligned, so you're always doing what you can to keep the co-op alive. And then equal power for membership, so the membership feels empowered through their democratic control of the board of directors, and it's a way to share power and feel like your voice actually matters. Some potential downsides. I mean, you can get kind of philosophical about this. I guess the second one. It is harder to get started if you lack capital. When you have money, it's easy to start things up. But that if you pool as a community, you can pool together and I'm thinking of grocery co-ops and those types of things. But you can potentially have slower decision making because you do have to align interests and sort of like have a democratic process and it requires buy-in. There's a way though that like there are some tensions still where like for example membership might want to have like in housing cooperative where it might be a tough sell to increase everyone's quote unquote rent because you have to make improvements. But in the end, like if things are starting to fall apart, like, okay, yes, we have to make the investment that we need to improve things. But I think overall, the interest being aligned and like the fact that cooperatives last a lot longer than other, like say traditional businesses or business groups, I mean, that's a case for choosing a model that lasts a while. Actually, finally, I forgot to mention this in the last one, but technically Vanguard is a cooperative as well. It's a fund owned by its clients in a way, which is why they're able to have such low cost index funds. So they're not out to make money for themselves, because the way that they make money is by properly managing the money. So that's an example of aligning with interest right there. So what does it look like maybe for Orcasound to have a call? Largely, this will be a discussion among this group here and those who are listening and those who aren't. But basically, it would allow us to represent the different interests between, say, scientists, conservation-minded community members, maybe hydrophone hosts, fisheries, workers themselves might have a voice in some way. And we could have a mix of organizations represented as well as individuals. So what that would look like for us is we would decide who should have a voice and to what proportion on the board of directors. Then we would establish bylaws, and we would have an actual formal structure around how we make decisions, how we resolve, conflicts of interest, etc. Hopefully go farther together. That's it. Are there any questions? Yes, Paul.
Would you say that, just having read the MOA together?
Yeah.
Would you say that, isn't it kind of a cooperative?
I think it's
Mostly, like not maybe by any legal standard, but it kind of already is now.
There's no decision-making apparatus.
No, and it's
There are
like
no
very
resources to
loosely
distribute.
specified, right? Like it's kind of like vaguely, like would you agree with that, or would you?
Yeah, I think it's about the beginnings. It's a proto
Yeah, okay.
No decision-making body, no processes, no bylaws, nothing. Regularly scheduled, sort of here's where things are, here's what we're doing. Could be interesting maybe for the hydrophone collective to be a member of, that could be represented as well. Yeah.
I think comment your question is not on something you mentioned, but it's something that is partly orthogonal to this, but it fits under government, okay, which is about tax exempt versus non-tax exempt.
Yeah.
Okay? Right now, Orcasound is not tax exempt, which does limit the types of contributions we get, right? Scott mentioned, and even in the hackathon, right, we had to donate hours to one of the two organizations. The hackathon said, hey, we suggest you donate your hours to one of the other two things, right? Which makes it a lot more complicated to track. And so in terms of the governance structure, I would like to ask if there's a reason we should not go through the process of becoming a 501c3 instead of the other acronym that's always hard to understand and explain. So, which is somewhat orthogonal because you can have cooperatives either way, right?
I think so, yeah.
But still under the governance.
I think it's really important that you said that, right? Like that.
Because to me, that's the bigger issue, because right now, if I look at the size of the pie there, that big question mark right there can be a lot larger if we had a 501c3. And then that means you could have a lot more in your mission. Now, of course, I've not been in it as long as you guys, so maybe you know better than I do, but I'm just saying that's where I see the biggest gap is right now, is there's sources of funding that just can't come here. They have to be funneled through one of the other things that's on the leftmost piece on Scott's slide, right?
And it's about that should get started, like we should get it rolling sooner rather than
And
later.
if it comes through there, that means somebody else has control of those funds and not this potential board of directors if there was one, right?
Yeah, at the base of it, again, like, I think you're right. It's a orthogonal, like how you manage things. Like you can have both a nonprofit arm and either for-profit or I don't know, whatever.
Even under Open Collective, right, as the site, whatever, you can have it be hosted by a funding organization that is tax exempt and still use Open Collective. You just can't do it under the open source collective 501c6, right? You'd have your own 501c3 and still use Open Collective.
Yeah, good point. And I mean, at the end of the day, as far as like legal structure is concerned, I would suggest that we, talk with a lawyer. There are cooperative lawyers. Actually, do you know one?
Not knowing any better, that would actually be my preference right now, is to have a collective that's a 501c3.
What is the price approximately to maintain a non-profit fund or like establish?
It's pretty cheap. Right now, I'm the president of another 501c3, 50K. Also, it's smaller than the pie here, right? And it's pretty cheap to maintain. So, I'm familiar with ones. I'd help run one that's even smaller than this pie. So,
You have to file once a year. I think formation is like 1,000 to 2,000, somewhere in there.
Yeah. I wasn't the first one, so I didn't with the formation, but I'm the current one.
So
it's like five.
50K annual,
What's that?
you said 50,
50K.
That's the budget.
the budget.
I am currently the president of a board of a 501c3 whose whole pie is in the 50K range, right? Which is like a quarter of this pie, right?
It was really fast.
I found it to be,
Yeah, and I don't consider it to be heavyweight in that sense, right? Meaning there's a lightweight version.
So the only, I mean, it seems clear that there's a huge advantage in being tax exempt, right?
Because you can get donations that would otherwise be funneled to other organizations.
So there would just be a question of whether we're creating a new one or trying to find an umbrella.
Correct.
there's an annual 990 report.
Correct.
Right,
Yep.
which
Yes.
you can have a president do or
Yep.
another officer.
And
I
you're
found
basically,
it to be about equivalent to the overhead for running an LLC
You're
or
just-
a corporation.
and the 990 you're exempt for the first 5 years. You basically file a 990N for the first 5 years that says, I don't need to file yet because you have to, in your 501c3, at least there's many types of 501c3s, but for most of them, you have requirements that have to be met across a 5-year average as charged with your public support, if you're a public support 501c3, right? And so for the first 5 years, you get a little bit of a pass since you file a 990N that says, I'm still in my first 5 years. After that, then you have to show across the last 5 years, you've been doing stuff, right? So it's actually, even for the first 5 years, it's very negligible for the first 5 years.
Just filing and
Yeah, I have a question for Standard, I guess, but for everyone really, just in terms of structure here. So if you were to have a 501c3, for example, or an LCA or any other structure, I think you could do it multiple ways. One is you could like subsume the whole existing MOA, for example, and just have that be like a parent org. Or you could have an org that just joins the MOA, right? And the same way that there's a lot of other member orgs, you could have
Either one.
a new, like,
that makes
you
more
know,
sense to,
an Orcasound, Orcasound, like 501c3, that just is another MOA member, and it's, that's like the main, that's what it's like for like a sponsor, for the 501c3 status. So I don't know which variant is better, but
well, it's a
those are
different
both options.
purpose, right?
Yeah.
So making it a new organization makes sense to me. And I guess that's the key for me is just like, okay, so this thing that we're trying to help be born in the world is about orca conservation, right? And maybe something a little broader than that. And so like on your other side, you have cooperatives of producers, cooperatives of workers, cooperatives of consumers, like, and I was trying to fit and multi-stakeholder, sure. I mean, but you're still like, who you're accountable to, what is the body of people, whose power you are trying to sort of equalize or put into conversation, put into community. And I guess my thought was it's the community people who care about orca conservation, rather than being a cooperative of the people in this room, for example. I just like, is that how we're imagining it? Yeah. I don't know which of
First,
you.
Val has a question. Then I have a comment.
Okay, let me.
Here you go. There we go.
Can you guys hear me at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the past, when Trump came in the first time, they got rid of, they changed the tax structure. They're going to revisit that again here pretty soon, probably. But when they did that, for lower income people like myself, people making less than 250,000 a year or something, the 501c3 value of contributions really went away because we don't, many of us don't itemize our taxes anymore. And so from my point of view, and people in my low income bracket, I stopped giving to 501c3s for tax reasons, and we give to people for social welfare reasons, but not for tax reasons. And I think that's a major shift that came out sort of 6 or 8 years ago, and should be at least a part of this conversation to be sure that the extra administrative effort of a 501c3, which I remember when Scott was doing everything himself, was one more burden. We think, why do we do this? And that's kind of where this all got started about 7 or 8, 10 years ago.
I mean, so that sort of the following question to be like, are we more interested in being accountable to and raising money from individuals at large? Or is there just a huge amount of money to be gotten from grants that would be much easier to get as a nonprofit? Or donations, like from major foundations, things like that. And I don't know if we know the answer to that. I don't know if we have a view of the land, as it were, like with the relative opportunities.
But I would certainly posit that like listeners, community, like sort of the conservation goal is one that unites us here. There's certainly a big presence, or would probably be a big presence at the board. Whether we wanted to add more different classes or I guess groups represented. So I mean, again, like practically what you would do is you would say have a board of, I don't know, 9 or 12, and you can say X number of seats goes to, you know, the broad listenership or the just Orcasound as a whole, the people who as individuals want to be part
I
of
was just
it.
trying to respond to those
Oh,
points
sorry.
about tax, like the tax status of the organization.
Yeah, that I don't think.
Yeah, I actually make me think just from an organizational overhead perspective. I obviously the financial aspect is part of it, but I think what maybe Scan is kind of touching on here that that's becoming not the whole thing, right? And there's also like just a organizational, you know, what do we prioritize, what do we do, that kind of stuff. So like there may already be a needed fixed cost. You know, look, we're having this summit for the first time, for example. Actually maybe something you want to do every year. You want to actually have get everyone together and choose priorities in a way that's been specified ahead of time, how that should work. So maybe if you're already doing that, you know, at that point, maybe the extra overhead of filing some paperwork is not necessarily a problem at that point. But you know, maybe it is. I don't know. I actually don't know what would be involved. But yeah, just my thought.
I don't have too much more to add to the current thought, but I have sort of a separate couple of questions. One is, I like your challenge. It's like, where do we fit in what you put up on the board? Also, I'm interested to ask you specifically, like, are there any examples of cooperatives within the open source software community globally? Like, I just wonder if there's some sort of transnational use case which maybe we're moving to. That's one question. It's sort of contextualized by that middle plot. There's like, I've thought a lot about like Canada versus US, the fact that there's the BC Hydrophone Network that inspired us. There's federal and provincial funds up there that could be leveraged.
And think of that map of where the listeners are. Like that was wild for me to see.
Yeah.
Like why are people in Chile or, you know, wherever, in Germany listening to this?
So
Yeah, so
And also the orcas are all over as well. So
like we're not actually limited. I mean, again, there might be a little bit more overhead here, but we're not limited to creating just one organization. Like we could create a cooperative, say, for the Orcasound like listening community. That's one. But then that is a member organization. I would say this greater, like we've got different like other I don't know if we can have governmental bodies in there. Probably need to be non-governmental, but like, yeah, you can have a cooperative of cooperatives and different interests. So, I mean, that was, I thank you so much for bringing in all of those charts and the graphs, because knowing what the landscape is, we might be able to section off, oh, here's a group of interests, here's a group of like people together in some way that needs some more like collective guidance, governing situation. So yeah, I leave that discussion to those who know the ecosystem.
yeah, well, I'm happy to walk through those eventually, but are any of these examples that you've provided transnational?
Transnational, Mondragon, I think technically is mostly Spain. I don't know if they have any members outside of it. It might be like
They're like San Sebastian, Basque Country. I
France?
don't think they're outside of Spain.
Okay.
But they have clients around the world, so they probably have presence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that might be more of a legal question, and not like I don't know, like enforcement agency or something like that. However, I don't imagine that.
From a quick web search, Open Source Initiative, OSI, is a global scale 501c3 cooperative in the open source space.
Wow.
I'm not familiar with them, but do they exist? The answer is yes.
I assume in the US, because that's an.
Yeah, correct. Because they have a 501c3 US, but that's just from quick web search, so.
I think global nonprofits often
Open source
incorporated in the UK actually ends up being easier than dealing with the US if a lot of your funding is from outside the US. So the question about being global is interesting. I was also wondering if you came across any other examples. I spent a lot of the last 10 years working with nonprofits, and like paying attention to power dynamics there. And so like the question of cooperativism and unionism in nonprofits is really interesting. I was wondering if you came across any examples of ways. Yeah, I think it's like, I'm really interested in avoiding the nonprofit industrial complex and some of the pitfalls there, aligning accountability better with the actual mission.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Yeah, so my understanding of, nonprofit industrial complex, there's misalignment of incentives where the funders, like, at the end of the day, you're like, okay, whatever we need to do to get that funding, and then you end up doing things that are, whatever, studying to the test exactly, just get that funding. But like the idea of like creating a cooperative will help align. I don't know of any off the top of my head that are nonprofit, but I'm happy to look.
I mean, this is
From a quick glimpse search, the Mozilla Foundation, which does the Firefox browser, is a nonprofit cooperative, as is Electronic Free Frontier Foundation, EFF, as is Apache.
Cool.
like
People may have heard of
potential.
them.
They've been around for a while, so that's, yeah.
But it's also important to look at exactly because, I think I was talking to Skinner actually, he's asking me about prepping for this. And I think a lot of the question is also just, a cooperative is a more generic form of like, instead of having, a board that's just, a specific set of people, you might be able to represent a wider range of groups. So it's a more generalized form of entity, but then it matters specifically like, well, who's actually, which groups are represented, right? So for example, we talked about all the forms of co-ops represents, someone who's trying to buy stuff together, produce stuff together, stuff like that. So specifically, I think that matters as well. But that also, I think, is where that's the hard part, right? Is about actually figuring out how to align all the incentives and make sure that, you're actually accomplishing the goals you're trying to accomplish. And especially long-term, that those, you can kind of stick to the ones you have. And that's why tie it back into funding, because I think, that's the next step here is also to kind of think about how this drives to funding. That's why I think because the point I was trying to make that you want to, maybe try to align even the things we build or the things we invest in building to align with where, maybe what kind of value is producing it for who. So for example, I said like, hydrophones, obviously the folks who are listening to them might benefit directly, whereas whoever's using the data, they might have a different view of what needs to be built or what the priorities are.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then you can kind of represent all those groups and try to represent all of their voices. And try to balance
unified under some sort of mission, right?
Yeah,
It's not
absolutely.
just-
Yeah.
Which is why I was saying, well, it's sort of the cooperative of people who are wanting to collectively conserve, organs. Sorry, Valentina, you've been at the end.
Yeah, I totally agree with that all the groups should be combined and they'll have very different incentives, despite they all say that they align with that mission. But I also think that maybe there's gonna be need for even more groups, because you can say, oh, we can like, kind of like, for example, like all the local community whale watching and kind of entities and so on, because you can say we can conserve the orcas if we just wipe out all the humans. And don't solve, right? But there's
Yeah, we didn't even change.
competition, with regard to the, like with the folks in the Puget Sound Marine Exchange. I mean, they have other objectives, when they share, they have nothing against the slowing down, but sometimes they get delayed.
Yeah.
because of this. So I think we should make sure we are not in a bubble.
Yeah, but basically we need to make sure that orcas don't get too many board seats. Yeah.
Yeah, and so.
So I have to correct, the three that I mentioned are not collectives, they're nonprofits. I read the site wrong. But there are ones, those three aren't.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I think cooperatives have kind of, in some ways they're everywhere, but in other ways they're not very well known. In fact, actually another fun fact, cooperative law has been around 4 years before the establishment of like for-profit corporations in Britain. I have it in my notes here, but cooperatives are a more general kind of governance structure.
I guess, this is really interesting for getting at our values and asking these questions. like in terms of action items that, for the next, or even for this year, it's probably more about expediency. Like we would form a nonprofit if we think there's a big opportunity to raise more money that way or something like that. But I think maybe this is part of what Paul was getting at. Like if the fastest thing is just to form an LLC or something, or just keep using the collective, but understand better what that money is for and why and who can spend it. Like those are the sort of immediate concerns.
Yeah, so
And like formalizing those values in terms of a governance structure or something.
so
It's something not we're gonna figure out today, but
yeah, so I mean, it could be, the co-op could be a nonprofit, I think.
for sure.
Is that, yeah. So I mean, whether we create one or maybe repurpose another one, I think our next task is really to understand the groups that there are, the groupings that we want to make with them, and then maybe like an apportionment of that power on the board, and whether we raise money or not, I mean, like that's, I think, the second.
And well, giving that, I guess I'm saying give that process the time it needs. But in parallel to that, figure out how we're gonna keep moving forward, right? Like,
Yeah, that's a good point. Like there's actually current funding concerns or fundraising concerns potentially, and we also need to be able to address
there's
those.
over $7,000 sitting in that
Yeah.
open collective, and I don't know how, who's allowed to spend that money and.
Well, it's gonna be less because we have food to.
We ate it all.
Anyway, so that's my portion then. Yeah.
Thank you for the intro. Cooperators 101.
I guess the reason I brought up the nonprofit stuff is especially since it came up when we had like the hackathon, right? Because we had a bunch of people that are Microsoft employees, right?
Yep.
Everyone that's a Microsoft employee can donate, but only to 501c3s for the matching hours and stuff. Same thing for if you're a Google employee or a Boeing employee or whatever. And so with it's plenty in the pie that we can't get right now. Now, I get Dell's
Immediate
point, right?
practical
There may
concern,
be
yeah.
people on lower incomes that you might lose some money, and so maybe the food structures, and you have to say how much you're leaving on the table right now. That either not going to anything in the whole Orcasound umbrella of organizations, or are going to another 501c3 and not necessarily being used for the Orcasound purposes that could be, right?
Yep.
And so the 501c3 thing that I sit on the board of, the majority of their funds actually come through the benevolity through these companies and stuff, meaning more than half of them, right? So just in terms of scale, that's because it's based on the Seattle East Side, where a lot of people work for one of the various companies that do company matching, right? And so I don't know how much that applies to here. I don't know, but I'm just saying through my experience at the Microsoft Hackathon, it seems to me like there's a bunch of opportunity that could be there.
I believe it.
Yeah, it sounds like for action item here, like one of the first steps would be just to list like what are the current opportunities
Yep.
that we may be, seeing how much urgency is there around, maybe considering having charitable stuff, because there are a lot of solutions for that. I mean, a very immediate one is just to find a sponsor org who's part of the MOA already.
And that's kind of what we did at the hackathon last. You said, oh, you got to donate to one of these two, but they don't necessarily flow into the same chart the same way. They might be directed to these other funds, right? Or the other efforts that those organizations maintain.
Yeah, but I think just the action item just being like, what is the urgency of different, what could get us to maybe, unlock certain funds or be a bit more efficient about them. And then what are maybe potential sources that we're missing out on?
To reverse engineer this a little bit, I might suggest that right now there's $500 that need to be spent. Right? It's not a very big number, but it doesn't mean you can't start talking about who decides how that gets spent. It's money that came from you and me, through individual contributions. I think the GitHub sponsors for a while, and one of Valentina's students was was our first GitHub sponsor. So there's like a little bit of a tiny proof of concept of a funnel going into this collective, but almost no guidance on like how does budgeting, like are there budgeting tools in the Open Collective? We have some questions for the people who actually run the Open Collective, and we have a need scanner for a better platform for like asking these questions, like how does cooperative keep track of expenses, budget, for example, or track progress against budget. So one thing that Val and I were thinking about doing is like there is a category we created for like ecosystem sponsor, which is like you have to contribute 10K or more in order to be like one of the first 10 ecosystem sponsors. Like I haven't talked to anybody into doing this yet, but I think I could probably talk Quiet Sound into doing it. And maybe there's a foundation at some point that would do this or other, I'm actually really mostly interested in like, as we keep adding data products that are useful to industry, can we go to like the Marine Exchange of Puget Sound is a nonprofit that has 100 industry members in the shipping industry. Maybe they would like to be a $10,000 sponsor. So Greenreach is ready in this year or next year, whenever we need to do this test. It's like become the first ecosystem sponsor and put 10K in there. There's maybe a more meaningful, like motivational amount to budget and allocate as a community. If we did that, which we're ready to do today, like I'd be happy to do that during the meeting. But then the next question in my mind is like that beginning of a purple list. I'd love to get your thoughts on like, what would the members look like? Like if we were to have representation of, I'm sort of half teasing, but I actually think of Beam Reach's board as being the matriarchs of the Southern residents. Like now when we do our annual budgeting, thinking of what thing to invest in next, thermal cameras or AI for boat recognition, we're trying to think about like, what would the matriarch say? So I think that would be really cool to have that transboundary Canada-US cooperative that also has some representative of this transboundary species. Maybe it has to broaden eventually to like, if Orcasound becomes a source of open bioacoustic software, maybe it has to expand its membership in some way. But at least having some international component and some trans species component, I think would be really exciting to like think about like, what does that cooperative look like in terms of membership? How do we empower the folks in our community who are providing a lot of time and not necessarily getting paid? That's the other really important thing to try to capture there, which I started to do, but I'm not sure I've got every category of potential member.
So then I just want to kind of point that I think these numbers are in the end still pretty small.
Yeah.
Even the largest one was still the RD number.
Yeah.
And none of those like feed people well, except for a random one. I'm
Yeah.
talking in terms of like, like salary. Yes. So that's something to consider, because also if something has run for some time like that, it's a question of whether it has run well for the people and how it has run well for the people. And understand that. You can say, oh, we managed to do it, it's only got money. And question like, was it good for those people?
Yeah, so my only thought on that is sort of related to the idea of creating another nonprofit that has a mission related to Southern resident recovery. Like Beam Reach used to be in that world when we were a 501c3, mostly doing education around Southern resident killer whales. And there are some foundation grants and families that can leverage it, but there's a lot of competition. Like and that competition tends to create territoriality rather than longevity, in my experience. So I'm reticent to go back in. I'm more interested in maybe pioneering new sources of funding outside of the traditional conservation community. It's a strategic thought. Dave?
So just on the multinational part, I mean, right now our mission is focused primarily on the SRKWs.
Yeah.
But there's some things that we do that aren't limited to that in the value, right? If you think about, the Hydra node, the node software and things like that. And if we look at where our listeners are around the world, it's not just people who would be able to benefit from the SRKW work. And so I don't know if, because you're thinking about, other products or whatever, you said, well, maybe the hydrophone node and monitoring system is stuff that would be of interest outside the SRKW community. And that might then generate opportunities for revenue sources that are outside the COC area.
Yeah.
So not just international between the US and Canada, but between the other parts on that picture that you showed earlier for where all of our listeners are from, right? So maybe Australia and, Europe and so on.
A lot of the infrastructure would be the same if you're tracking birds.
That's my point is it says, okay, if we have a product, does that fit into the does it fit into the Orcasound Cooperative's mission?
Right.
Do we change the mission statement? Do we have two cooperating organizations, one that focuses on the SRKW aspect, one that focuses on the global aspect? I don't know. I'm just brainstorming.
I mean, I can give you an example that's actually much closer to what we're actually doing right now. We mentioned conservation. That's definitely like the primary focus of Orcasound. It's kind of been officially and unofficially, but there is a secondary interest around like just research around orca behavior, intelligence, communication, stuff like that. There are opportunities there as well. I know a few folks who've been interested, like we have Profil specifically who's very interested in that. And he, I've talked to him about potential funding opportunities there. Like how do we look at those things, for example, and how many focuses can we have, right? Like what is our, and that's why I think the discussion's kind of intertwined both with the funding side, like what kind of value can we provide with the things we're doing and to who, and then also that informs the governance, because based on that, we might choose to do certain projects because they provide funding and they align with our values and our governance, and other ones because they don't.
I think things like ship noise should be fairly globally applicable, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's sort of like a vertical element, which is what you're talking about, being accountable to the whales.
Yeah.
And figuring out all the things that need to happen in order to do that. And then there's this horizontal thing where you have like an infrastructure company, basically. It seems like the vertical thing is what we already have. Right?
Yeah.
Those are our prior commitments. But there's this opportunity, maybe now, maybe more likely later on, and actually that's when we talk about cooperatives, that's where I think like, okay, so the bird people need this too. So why don't we build one thing that is a data infrastructure and so forth, and some designs for some people computers, whatever, and find efficiencies there, working horizontally. That's just sort of where my imagination goes. Yeah.
So just one example of how this happens, but like on a slower scale. Like for example, we engage students, and it's not that focused on conservation because the students don't even understand the big goals yet. And we spend a lot of time, let's say, training them doing something. So they're not directly contributing to the conservation, but in like maybe like half a year, they build something that we can use backwards. So it's like these initial engagements, like just going around and telling people, it's like let's train them on the open source. We spend a lot of time training them on some of the basics. At some point, some of the students started training us, like showing us stuff. So it wasn't directly the conservation itself, but it was this exchange of knowledge that is in this.
A long view of conservation.
Yeah, like
The rest of the community.
you call it horizontal line. It can be.
No, that's the vertical.
Oh, that's the vertical.
Yeah.
It's
Like we have a resource let's make as much use of it as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a platform.
I see. What is it in terms of the feedback, kind of, because it's not like just one way. It's like this. I see this cycle that we have something, others give us something else. So it's not just we have the resource for other people to use, but we have one resource and they give us other resources.
Yeah.
This exchange thing.
Yeah, that's just being part of a community, right?
Okay.
And that makes, in my mind, that has to do with the sort of vertical way of looking at it. Vertical means like from the sort of the top of the stack is our mission, and the bottom is sort of layers of things that we need in order to make that happen. Not all of those are the organization itself. Some of them are our relationships to our community.
Okay.
Not to get too into the abstract conceptualization here, but
Yeah, I think we're actually going to get into it probably in the next thing we're going to do, which I think is talking about like vision and priorities. And I think maybe Adrian's, if it's anything like the past exercises we've done with Adrian, I think we'll kind of might even have that vertical representation. I don't know if we have that. I think so, or,
Maybe not in the same
maybe not.
sense, but there is a hierarchical prioritization that takes a vertical form.
wow, isn't that for a segue?
Yes, thank you, Paul, for that segue. Next on I think this conversation is great and it's a good start. I think we should continue having it.